Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. It's Michael Shermer. My guest today is the great Richard Dawkins. His new book is Books Do Furnish a Life, Reading and Writing Science. As you know, Richard needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. He's the author of The Selfish Gene. He was voted the Royal Society's most inspiring science book of all time, and also the bestsellers The Blind Watchmaker, Climbing Mount Improbable, The Ancestor's Tale, The God Delusion, and 2 volumes of an autobiography, An Appetite for Wonder, and Brief Candle in the Dark. He's a fellow of New College, Oxford, and both the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Literature. In 2013, Dawkins was voted the world's top thinker in Prospect Magazine's poll of 10,000 readers from over 100 countries. I have to agree, he is one of the great thinkers of our time, really of all time, and certainly in evolutionary theory, one of the most important since Darwin. His new book is a compendium or a collection of his forewords, afterwords, reviews, essays, commentaries on books, mostly science books, a lot of evolutionary books, and so forth. This podcast is brought to you by Wondrium, our sponsor. It's the former Great Courses. Of course, you've heard me talk about that. Wondrium is the expanded version of that. It's a subscription service in which you can access all those great courses and their lectures, plus documentary series and other content that they've acquired through relationships with other companies. So it's really great. For example, I took this one years ago called The Darwinian Revolution, apropos my guest today, in which there are 24 lectures in which you uncover the remarkable story of Darwin's ideas, how scientists and religious leaders reacted to them, and the sea change in human thought that resulted. All right, so 24 lectures, 30 minutes each. Listen to about 1.25 speed. You can grind through them in 20 minutes. So on an hour commute, you get 3 lectures, or workout, or walk, or hike, or whatever. So it's great. If you subscribe through my podcast, you get a free month. So this is the deal. Just go straight to wondrium.com/Shermer. Sign up for your free trial. Cancel anytime in the future. And you can give it a shot, and you'll see it's like all these other subscription services. It's great, just endless content, just a sea of just flowing information coming into your brain through your earbuds. So it's great. Wondrium, wondrium.com/Shermer, get you the free trial. And now onto the podcast. Richard and I discuss, of course, evolutionary theory, his conversations with Neil deGrasse Tyson, Steven Pinker, Matt Ridley, and Christopher Hitchens. The audio edition, by the way, of Richard's new book is great because those conversations are recorded and they're actually played in the audio version. In the book, of course, they're transcribed. We talk about science books as literature and why no one has won the Nobel Prize in Literature from the sciences. Talk about evolutionary adaptationists and hyper-adaptationism, spandrels, group selection, other kind of spin-offs of evolutionary theory. And to what extent natural selection is a force. It's not. It's kind of a myth. It's a descriptive term for things that happen in nature. Of course, we talk about Hitch and Richard's relationship with him and what a great thinker he was. Religious truths versus political truths versus empirical or scientific truths. And then kind of wrap up talking about the grand questions, that is, the Mysterian mysteries, or to what extent we can ever understand truly whether there's a God or not, whether there's free will determinism, what's the nature of consciousness, what does nothingness mean? We drilled down on this one. It's a super interesting subject. A universe from nothing, what does that mean, nothing? No thing, but what is a thing? The idea of God, that's a thing. So in truly nothingness, there can't even be the concept of God. So what are we even talking about of nothingness? So anyway, I hope you enjoy this conversation with the great Richard Dawkins. Thanks for listening. Yes, well, Hitch is just remarkable that he's able to speak in like whole paragraph-long sentences that are just perfectly articulated, yes, as if he had written them, yes, down. And yes, so that, and then also the interview you did with Matt Ridley and about genetics and how people still misunderstand evolution. But before we get into all that, I just, I'll have already introduced the book. This is the UK version. I think the US version has a similar
it looks the same.
cover. But in any case, yeah. But in any case, I think of this as kind of a third culture book, like our mutual agent friend John Brockman introduced this idea that that books should not just be either scholarly or popular, dumbed down versions, but that in fact they should be just one version that anybody could read. And that takes a lot of skill. And I always think of your Selfish Gene as a perfect role model. Also Pinker's, Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, or Matt Ridley's books, or a number of these, Dan Dennett's books. Those aren't the pop versions of the technical professional papers they wrote, like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. That's the only version there is, and anybody could read it.
I strongly agree, and I feel that scientists ought to do more to try to write in a way that's accessible to other people. I think actually they would actually understand themselves better. We scientists would actually understand ourselves better if we wrote as if for a lay audience.
It's hard to do. It takes a lot of practice and work, and it's a learned skill. Almost like, I think of it as like people that watch American Idol, of all the singers, or any of the kind of contests where most people are not good at this, and they think, well, I could do that. And then you see most of the people on these shows, it's like, they're awful. That's probably what I would be like. And writing is like that. It just takes a lot of practice. So, let me just give you, I'll read some passages from the book to give your voice a break here. You open with the literature of science. First, just give us the distinction you make at the very beginning of the two types of literature.
Yes. This was two different definitions from, okay.
Yeah, so you have from the Oxford English Dictionary, that kind of written composition valued on account of its qualities of form or emotional effect, and then B, the body of works in writing that treat of a particular subject. So you provide some beautiful examples of this kind of literature. I love the first one you have from Sir James Jean in his 1930, The Mysterious Universe. Standing on our microscopic fragment of a grain of sand, we attempt to discover the nature and purpose of the universe which surrounds our home in space and time. Our first impression is something akin to terror. We find the universe terrifying because of its vast, meaningless distances, terrifying because of its inconceivable long vistas of time which dwarf human history to the twinkling of an eye, terrifying because of our extreme loneliness, because of the material insignificance of our home in space, a millionth part of a grain of sand out of all the sea sand in the world. But above all else, we find the universe terrifying because it appears to be indifferent to life like our own. Emotion, ambition, and achievement, art, and religion all seem equally foreign to its plan. Oh, man. Was that your inspiration for your famous sentence about the universe, as blind, pitiless indifference?
No, but I think it's a very good example of the way scientists ought to write. It ought to be, we ought to inspire people with a kind of poetic feeling about the universe, or about life, or about geology, or about... I subscribe to what I call the Carl Sagan school of science writing, where you try to inspire with the poetry of science, rather than with the usefulness of science. There's nothing wrong with being useful, of course, and science is immensely useful, but that's not all it is. And I think the poetic inspiration of science is something which we need to get across, and which James Jean does in that passage, which Carl Sagan does in everything he ever wrote.
Yes, you provide his famous pale blue dot soliloquy, which you can find online in many YouTube versions where people have cut in visuals to go along with it. And so Carl famously writes...
That's so well known. Maybe I shouldn't have bothered to quote that really, because it is so well known, but it is lovely.
I just think it's beautiful. Yeah, you also have... I'll just read a few others just to give an example of what you're talking about, of the kind of scientific literature. This from Peter Atkins. In the beginning, there was nothing, absolute void, not merely empty space. There was no space, nor was there time, for this was before time. The universe was without form and void, obviously lifted right from Genesis, but emphasizing the point.
Yeah.
Often, just sort of listening to the interviews in the book and reading your chapters, especially when you talk about like group selection and, not in our genes, this idea that, human behavior and emotions cannot just be reduced to some material substance, I still get the feeling that there's this transcendental temptation, even among a lot of scientists, that there's something else besides the stuff. And then almost like that famous Sidney Harris cartoon with the two mathematicians at the chalkboard, and in the middle he says, and then a miracle happens. It's almost like
Yes.
in a lot of these debates, it's like, and then, consciousness, and then a miracle happens. Well, wait a minute.
Yes.
You need to be more specific here in step 2.
Exactly. I think it's worse than that. I think it's a betrayal of everything that science stands for. Because if you allow miracles to happen, then you might as well just pack up science altogether and just not bother with it. Science is all about doing it in spite of the lack of miracles. Once you allow a miracle to get smuggled in, then you've sold the past, you've given up on science, you've betrayed science.
I think so. And I'm not just talking about supernatural. I'm talking about even if you deal with the hard problem of consciousness, which is a hard problem. Maybe it's just a conceptual problem. I like the way Steve Pinker puts it. It's not a scientific problem. It's a conceptual problem. Namely, our concepts about consciousness are, such that we can't solve it in some scientific way. As if the homunculus in my head could go over into your skull to see what the red looks like on your screen. Just these kind of weird ideas we have of what it's like to be somebody else. It's just conceptually not possible. And I think, just take something like the group selection thing. You have several chapters on that and the problems with group selection. And I've read Ed Wilson and David Sloan Wilson and the mathematicians, and I follow the arguments along, and then it's almost like they go, and then a miracle happens, and the group is all of a sudden doing this thing. It's like, wait a minute, the group is just a bunch of individuals. So you still got to somehow bore into the individual. So I still feel. But I think, what did Dan Dennett call that? A crane, right? A crane reaches in and does something miraculous.
Crane. Yeah. Yes, that's right. I got a lovely picture, which I sent to Dan, of a crane lowering a cross onto a church. I thought it was a beautiful illustration of exactly what he's talking about. And I think a slide for him to use.
Yes, and in your conversation with Pinker, you guys were talking about adaptations. And Steve pointed out that, when he talks about art or music as not adaptive, just a byproduct, a cheesecake analogy he used. And then he made the point that a lot of artists and people that study art and literature, they find that kind of offensive. Like, no, this is super important to the human condition. Therefore, it should be adaptive. They're misunderstanding what adaptation means, just being able to reproduce and survive into the next generation and so on. And if music didn't evolve for that reason, then somehow that lessens it in value. Of course, it doesn't. But still there, it feels like they're trying to say, well, a miracle happens. And then, music magically, does these things for us, or literature, art.
Yes, I think Steve is right when he says that, I think you alluded to it just now, that we have no right to expect that we should necessarily solve these difficult problems, like the hard problem of consciousness, or like quantum mechanics. Our brains were not adapted to understand these really difficult problems. In a way, it's a wonder. It's a wonder that we can understand so much, as much as we do, or at least some of us do. Not me in most cases, but that some members of the species Homo sapiens are capable of understanding quantum mechanics is, to me, a wonderful fact. And I feel humble that I can't understand it, but I have no right to expect to, because my brain was not evolved for that. And that's the point Steve makes.
You call that middle land, that we evolved in this middle-sized world in the plains of Africa, where things move the speed of, say, a running lion, or we can see things, say, between the size of an ant and a mountain range. So things like the speed of light and subatomic particles, there's nothing to hang those concepts on in our evolved brain, so they're conceptually difficult.
Yes. Do you think it's possible that if, as children, we were brought up with computer games which were kind of tailored to these weird things like particles going through two slits at once or something like that, whether if children were brought up like that, or put it another way, suppose a child was brought up in the space station, so they never experienced the pull of gravity, and they experienced gliding around weightless. We would all be natural Newtonians. We would have no problem with getting Newtonian physics anyway. I mean, the idea that once something starts moving, it carries on unless there's some reason why it won't, would come absolutely naturally to us if we'd been brought up in the space station. As it is, of course, we're brought up in a world where we're ruled by the tyranny of gravity.
Yes, that would be an interesting. Well, we're going to run that experiment, aren't we? We're going to have permanent space stations and people going into space, and then children. But I think the deeper problem will be the point you made about Middleland, is that it's in our evolved nature. Gravity does certain things.
Yes.
Things are up and down, and they move a certain way, and that's just part of our evolved nature to conceive of it. It's almost like, and then you have a long discussion in your book about nothing, what nothing means, like the passage I just read. I mean, you can't really conceive of nothing because to conceive of something, you have to exist. So you're something. So for example, to say, imagine what it's like to be dead, you can't do it. People think, well, there I am in my casket and people are mourning or whatever. No, you wouldn't see the casket. You wouldn't see you. There'd be nothing. Yes. It's like, but I don't know what that means, right?
No, it wouldn't be dark. It would just be nothing.
Right.
Okay.
We're talking about nothing. I just want to talk about that for a minute because, you had your conversation with Lawrence Krauss, his book, The Universe from Nothing. And again, this difficulty in conceiving of that. So I wrote an essay in my Giving the Devil His Due, using John Leslie and Robert Lawrence Kuhn's book, The Mystery of Existence, Why Is There Anything at All? And they really bore down on when you talk about nothing. I mean, so I'm in a room, you take all the stuff out, but there's still air, you take the air out, well, there's still walls and so on. So you go out in the universe, you take out all the planets and stars and gas and so on. But that's not even remotely close to nothing. So as Kuhn says, not just emptiness, not just blankness, and not just emptiness and blankness forever, but not even the existence of emptiness, not even the meaning of blankness, and no forever. And then he goes on to include, if you're going to take some things out of the universe to make it nothing, you'd also have to take logic and Platonic ideals and even the concept of God. So at some point, there can't be a God if you really mean nothing. And therefore, because we think of it like, well, there's nothing and then God is outside of it. But no, there would not be any outside. There'd be no God.
Yeah, that's right. I think Lawrence's universe from nothing, though, he's not talking about absolutely nothing. He's talking about this kind of, I forget how he phrased it, something kind of boiling, winking in and out of existence of quantum events and things. It's not nothing in this totally nothing sense you're talking about. It's that's one of the problems he gets into when talking to philosophers and theologians. By Lawrence's kind of nothing is not entirely nothing as many people would understand it. There's a sort of, what is his phrase, about boiling confusion of quantum events, something like that.
Quantum foam, I think he calls it.
That kind of thing, yes.
Yeah, so there, I'm like you, I'm lost. They talk about virtual particles popping in and out of existence. I don't really know what that means.
Well, I don't either, but it's what you need if we're going to explain the origin of everything, the origin of, well, the Big Bang, for example. You've got to have a quantum event, and I think he describes it as if matter and antimatter can neutralize each other and turn into nothing, then nothing can do the reverse and turn into matter and antimatter, something like that. So that's not quite nothing in this sort of total vacancy that you're talking about.
Yeah, so much of this kind of theological debate depends entirely on what you mean by the word. So we end up talking about words, not things that are actually out there.
As so often.
So often, yes, right. So I'm going to talk about the subject you and Neil discussed about to what extent people are irrational or rational. And of course, this is what I do for a living, is study human irrationality. But lately I've been kind of rethinking this. Somebody who says, I believe QAnon. Been thinking about this lately because this is a popular subject, and you're familiar with QAnon, and this kind of right-wing conspiracy theory about Democrats running this secret pedophile ring out of a pizzeria led by Hillary Clinton, where they're drinking the blood of children. It just goes on and on. It's hard to believe anybody would believe that. And yet some huge portion of Republicans, like a third, tick the box that, there might be something to this. What can they possibly be thinking when they say, yeah, I believe that? They can't believe. These are people that hold down jobs, they raise families, they can write a checkbook, they can balance, they invest in the stock market. They're rational people.
They can.
So there's something else going on.
They can tie their own shoelaces. Yeah. Yes. I think part of it is a matter of loyalty to the tribe. I think that, and it's not just them. I'm again, I think Steve Pinker makes the point that we all of us, to some extent, hold opinions that we do, not because we've thought them through, but because it's our tribe. It's what our tribe believes. I mean, I like to think that I don't, but I'm not that confident. And the Republican tribe, at least part of them, is a tribe that believes these ridiculous things. And it's not because they've thought it through or even really thought what it really means. But this is what my tribe believes. This is what our people believe. This is what Fox News believes. This is what QAnon believes. And it's a question of loyalty to the tribe. Something like that could be, it's not an adequate explanation, but perhaps a partial explanation.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes, because we know from research on people that say they accept climate science and global warming or they don't. Neither one of them really knows much about climate science. I mean, it's a technical science.
No.
People send me these articles I don't really understand, and computer models and all the math, and it's like, I don't know. But in a way, when I say, I accept global warming is real and human cause, I'm just signaling I trust science and that the scientists working in this field are competitive and they try to debunk each other, and somehow or another, when they reach a consensus, I can be reasonably confident they're probably right. Or on the other side, I don't trust authorities.
That is more rational. That is more, Mike. What you just said there is more rational, because you're saying, although I don't understand it, I trust the scientific process, peer review. People have examined the data. It's not quite the same as believing in your tribe. A little bit the same. It's a little bit like that. It's not quite.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a way of either trusting authorities or not. And there's reasons why not to trust scientists all the time because of error and fraud and things like that. But then you and I would counter, but it's the scientists themselves who weed out the fraud and the mistakes and the errors.
Yes.
Most of the replication crisis was exposed by scientists, graduate students or whatever, working in the lab.
It is reasonable to have faith in the scientific procedure where experiments are repeated, peer review, all the procedures that science has put in place to guard against bias, to guard against just following what you want to believe. I think science is pretty unique in having these procedures put in place to actually immunize ourselves against the dangers of simply believing what you want to believe.
Yeah. So this process works pretty well for, let's call them empirical truths, things that we can test. You can see it, I can see it, and you can run my experiment, and we can corroborate or test each other. But how do you think about, say, religious truths or political truths in a different way? And let me recount this story that I've been telling on this podcast many times. Hopefully it's not a false memory or a conflated memory. But I recall that you and I and Ken Miller were at a conference together on a panel or something like this. And Ken Miller is a world-class biologist and also a Catholic, and he wrote this book about Darwin's theory and so on. But at the last chapter, he says, I'm a Catholic. I accept Jesus as my savior and so on. And then if I recall correctly, you said something about, well, if we had a piece of the true cross, and on the piece of the true cross was a little piece of flesh, and we could extract Jesus's DNA, would it be, since he was born a virgin, right? Would it be something like a parthenogenesis, or would it be a full complement of DNA? And if I, again, recalling this story correctly, I think Ken said something like, Richard, I'm not claiming this is true. This is just what I believe. I'm a Catholic. Something like that.
He said something like that. He said, Richard, there's a reason it's called faith. That's what I remember him saying. There's a reason it's called faith. Yes. I think I met the same thing with Father George Coyne when I was interviewing him for television. He was the Vatican's chief astronomer at the time, or maybe just before. And we had a long and very, very nice conversation, and it was clear that we agreed about just about everything. And so finally I said to him, but Father Coyne, I don't understand why you believe in God and Jesus and all that. And he said, I was brought up that way. I can't help it. It was something like that. He couldn't help it because he was brought up a Catholic. He wasn't trying to defend it in any way based on evidence or rationality or thinking it through. It was just that's the way he was brought up. And I believe somebody told me recently that Ken Miller now more or less says just that he has absolutely no defense for what he believes at all. It's just that he's a Catholic, and so that's what he believes because that's the way he's been brought up. I suppose it's loyalty to the tribe again.
Yeah, because if you don't accept Jesus as Jesus' resurrection, then there's no reason to be a Christian. That's what it means to be a Christian. You might as well be a Jew or Muslim or nothing, right?
Yes, yeah. Actually, the phrase "loyalty to the tribe" is one that Martin Rees, the astronomer, is very keen on, but he does not believe in God. But he simply uses it because he goes to, when he was master of Trinity College, Cambridge, he used to go to the college chapel, and that was loyalty to the tribe. But that's a different meaning of the phrase. That was not believing something because of that. It was just going through the motions. That was just simply turning up, putting a gown on, and going to chapel because he was the master. And that's defensible. I could imagine doing that myself.
Yes, I remember in the 90s we did an issue with an interview with Martin Gardner, one of the modern skeptics, founder of the modern skeptical movement. And, he was a fideist. He said he believed in God and thought there might be an afterlife. You can't prove that there isn't. He agreed that atheists have better arguments than theists, but this is just what he believes because it makes him feel better. And he did. There's no point in arguing it because he's already conceded you atheists have the better arguments. It's like, okay, then at some point the conversation just stops. It's like, well, all right, then what? There's nothing to talk about.
I think he's a very idiosyncratic case. I was talking to Paul Kurtz about that once, and Paul Kurtz said he doesn't really believe it, but he wants to believe it because he wants there to be an afterlife, and so he kind of commits to, he tells himself that he believes it because it gives him consolation or something like that. That was Paul's summary of Martin Gardner's belief, which is a bit different, I think. I can't imagine doing it, but I somehow it was almost self-confessed wishful thinking.
Yes, I love Paul Kurtz's book, The Transcendental Temptation, because he shows in so many ways how we're tempted to transcend the material stuff where we began this conversation. Interestingly, I had Jamie Ian Swiss on the podcast a few months ago, and he was talking about how Paul got kind of suckered by Kreskin, the magician Kreskin, because Kreskin, he kind of hovered over the line of I'm just doing magic, and then over the line, but I'm also doing something else. And Kreskin would do these like mind reading mentalism things where he would have somebody in the audience hide an object that he couldn't see, but the volunteer on stage could see where it was and what it was or whatever. And then he would like hold the hand or hold the arm of the subject, the volunteer, and then walk around the audience. And he claimed he could like read the muscle movements or some kind of special power he had, but that wasn't it at all. He was doing something else. It was, a much simpler magic trick. And so Jamie was talking about how Paul kind of thought like, oh, he's got this, but Kreskin's different. He's got this special. And then, he Randy and Jamie had to kind of sit him down and go, no, that's not what's going on here. And then Jamie was talking about how audiences have become so sophisticated now. For a magician, you have to do something else. Like my favorite example of this was Banachek would, here's a deck of cards, pick a card, any card, sign the card, put it in the middle of the deck or whatever. And then he holds his hand up and they go, now look at my hand, and then think about the card. Think if it's a spade or a club, and think of the number as if he's reading your eye motions, right? Of course, this is all bullshit. This is misdirection. It's a forced card trick. He already knows what the card is, right? But Jamie was saying you kind of have to do this to make it seem more exciting, more interesting. Like, ooh, I've got this special. It's not supernatural. It's not paranormal. But I've got this kind of special power I can, use to read what you're doing, and that was kind of interesting.
I think conjuring magic is actually philosophically quite interesting because, a really good conjurer like Jamie himself, for example, you really feel the transcendental temptation quite strongly. You feel it's got to be a miracle, and no, it's not a miracle. It's not a miracle. It's just a trick.
Right.
But it's one of the most powerful ways to argue with people who are tempted by the transcendental temptation, is to point out how a really great conjurer like Jamie Ian Swiss or Darren Brown can almost force you to think it's supernatural, and yet they're honest enough to admit that it's not.
Yeah, Darren Brown is especially good at this. I mean, his shows are so elaborate. You just cannot figure out where the trick is. It's in there somewhere, and it's relatively simple.
Well, I never can anyways.
Yeah. I was telling Jamie this story about being on a cruise, a Scientific American cruise out to the Bermuda Triangle. Anyway, so everybody there is, in our group was, readers of Scientific American, presumably rational. And so I'm having dinner with some guy, and he goes, all right, I'm a skeptic too, and I don't believe in any of this spoon bending business like Uri Geller. But I saw this guy, he did this thing, and he twisted the spoon in a way with his mind that it's impossible. He could not have twisted it physically. So, and I know this bit because Jamie Ian Swiss showed me how it's done. You take a spoon and you sort of twist it this way rather than that way. It's kind of hard to show, but anyway, it's super simple. And so as he's telling me the story, I take the spoon next to me and I pull it beneath the table and I do the little move. And then as he's finishing the story, I said, did it look anything like this? And he's like, oh. And I could see in his eyes, he was thinking, I'm a skeptic too, but this one thing. And then had I not happened to know that, because I don't know all the tricks, he would have left thinking, well, but there is this little bit of magic left. It's like, no, there isn't. It's just, you just don't know. And sometimes I'll make the analogy like, there's something about mentalism that's different than, if Copperfield makes the Statue of Liberty disappear, do you really think he moved the atoms somewhere? People go, well, no, of course not. Yeah, right. Of course not. But the spoon bending thing, or the mentalism thing, there's something special there. No, it's just another trick.
Douglas Adams had quite a nice story about a man who didn't understand how television worked. And so he got an engineer to explain to him how television worked. The engineer, the man believed there must be lots of little men inside the television screen manipulating the electrons or something like that. Lots of little men. So the engineer explained to him how it worked and how it was scan lines and radio. He explained it all to him. And he said, yeah, okay, now I really do understand it. Okay, I understand it. But I expect there are just a few little men in there, aren't there? So it was just unwilling to quite let go of the last little bit of the magic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's there, and most people don't understand things. Again, I just think of this research by cognitive psychologists on when people say they understand something, and then you ask them to articulate it. Like, do you understand how an internal combustion engine works? Do you understand how a zipper works? Most people go, oh, yeah, of course. All right, explain it. And they're like, well, the thingy goes inside the other thingy and you pull it up. And they somehow, I don't know, right? In other words, they're kind of dumbfounded. And again, back to this more tribal thing, it's like, well, I'm against NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Do you know what's in it? No. Or immigration policy, or Afghanistan or whatever. Do you know what our policy is? Not really. So people think that they understand, like your whole lifelong program of explaining evolution. In your chapter on Ed Wilson, you actually make the statement, I think he never really understood kin selection. It's like, how could Ed Wilson not understand kin selection? But it's possible.
He seemed to understand it in The Insect Societies, which was his book in 1971. But then in 1975, sociobiology, he treated it as a subset of group selection, which it absolutely isn't. And I think from then on, he was on a downward path.
All right, Richard, picking up where we were talking about the kind of misunderstanding of evolution. I think people, in natural selection, people think of it as like a force instead of a description of what's going on in nature. And, some of this I attribute to, Darwin's own analogy of pigeon breeders, domesticated, animal breeders, because it implies that there is somebody top down making these decisions. And it's almost built into our language, like natural selection it's selecting for something, but there's no selection in a top-down way. And I think some of that misunderstanding about evolution is a result of the language we use.
Wallace, Darwin's co-discoverer, made this very point, and Wallace wrote to Darwin and said, "My dear Darwin, to you and me, this is as clear as daylight, but many people have such difficulty understanding that there is no selector." And that was why Wallace urged Darwin to change his language and start talking about the survival of the fittest instead of, which was Herbert Spencer's phrase, instead of natural selection. And Darwin did that, but he carried on talking about natural selection as well. I think rightly so. I think you've got to be pretty stupid to have that problem, really. I mean, I don't understand what's so hard about making the jump from pigeon breeding, where there is a human selector. And I think that Darwin's use of artificial selection, pigeon breeding, was superb. I think it's exactly what was required. And then, to me, it's just a seamless jump from that to say, okay, we don't actually need a pigeon breeder. Survival will do the job for us, or differential reproduction will do the job for us. But you're quite right that many people do have that problem. They seem to think that maybe I'm okay for a moment now.
Well, let me just. No, I thought you said it. You said it perfectly, and again, I agree. Some of it is the language, like the survival of the fittest. I think people think, well, physical fit, strong, fast, beautiful, smart. Yeah, because
that's what Darwin meant. It was only later that fittest became defined by population geneticists as that which survives, in which case it becomes a circular argument, a tautology. But the criticism that some creationists make that it's a tautology is again ridiculous. You can show that with respect to the pigeon breeding or the cattle breeding. If it really was a tautology, farmers would be wasting their time trying to breed cattle to give a high milk yield, because no, it's no good. You can't breed cattle with a high milk yield. It's a tautology. It won't work. It's absurd. Anybody can see that although it might have become a tautology when mathematical geneticists define fitness as that which survives. Nevertheless, if you go back to Darwin's definition, where it really did mean the strongest, the cleverest, the keenest of eye, fleetest of foot, and so on, then it does make perfect sense.
Yeah, and again, I think if we think of counter examples, like we think, well, the eye is good, and the more complex the eye, the better, and so on. Unless you're a blind cave fish, in which case it's better to not have an eye, because eyes cost energy to run, and if you don't need them, then not having eyes is the fittest thing. Or being, small and slow and camouflaged and dumb as a post, if that helps you survive, that makes you fit or fitter. So I mean, again, we have this kind of, big brains. The more brains you have, the better. Not necessarily. I mean, our brain takes up like a fifth of our total energy consumption or whatever for the 3 pounds. No, it's not necessarily so that organisms should evolve brains. So I did want to get your thoughts on directionality to evolution. You famously, wrote about the evolution of evolution. But that's something different than, say, convergent evolution, or is it inevitable? And I know you and I had this little debate years ago about, would extraterrestrial intelligences be something like us, with a head and got appendages and they'd be intelligent or something like that? How do you think about, convergent evolution and the inevitability, like Gould's famous rerun the tape? Obviously, we wouldn't be here, but something like an intelligent creature might evolve again.
I think they're two different issues. I think the issue of progress is one thing. The issue of whether we would expect to get, if we reran Kaufman's tape again, whether you would expect to get something like us. I think that's a genuine controversy, which is interesting. And on the one hand, we have Simon Conway Morris, who thinks that almost certainly if there's life elsewhere in the universe, or rather, there will be humanoids elsewhere in the universe. There'll be brainy bipeds with forward-looking eyes and hands like us. That's one extreme. The other extreme is the sort of Steve Gould extreme, which says nothing like us, it's totally different. I'm kind of on the Simon Conway Morris end of that spectrum. I think that convergent evolution is so impressive. And when you see the power of selection to produce, pillbug crustaceans and millipedes looking almost exactly alike, when you look at the Australian mammal fauna with these parallels, multiple parallels, I find convergent evolution so impressive that I believe in the Conway Morris version of the predictability of evolution. But the other issue is the one of progress, whether evolution is progressive. And that, I think, is more straightforward. It's just that progress doesn't necessarily mean progress towards what humans think of as progress, which is things like braininess. It's anything where you have, if A gives rise to B, gives rise to C, gives rise to D, if there's a trend from A to B to C to D, that is progress, even if it's progress in the direction of becoming less brainy or smaller or stupider. As long as it's transitive in a mathematical sense, then that's progressive. Now, progress in the sense of building up something complicated like an eye, that's got to be progressive in the full sense of becoming more complex, because you cannot get something like an eye in one fell swoop. That's the whole point of the argument against creationism. It's got to come gradually, because it's too improbable that you would get something efficient, something like an eye that works well to see in one fell swoop. It's got to come gradually, and that's got to be progressive. So something like the evolution of an eye has got to be starting with very simple beginnings and getting more and more complex, a better and better eye as time goes on. That, I think, is necessary. It doesn't mean that it's going to be progress from the origin of life to now, or from some very distant point in the past until now. It's more likely to be relatively rapid progress, maybe taking only about 5 million years, and then maybe starting again with another 5 million years, starting again with another 5 million years. So when the dinosaurs went extinct, the mammals only took about 5 or 10 million years to fill their places with progressive evolution. And if the present mammal fauna were to go extinct, it wouldn't take that long before progressive evolution would produce creatures as sophisticated as the ones we see today, by progressive evolution.
So maybe that would look like something like a Gould's punctuated equilibrium, where you see these, gaps in the fossil record, and then all of a sudden, rapid change. It's just a descriptive term for allopatric speciation, where you get a founding population that's small and you get rapid genetic change. And so you see these kind of halting steps. But again, people misunderstand this. They think punctuated equilibrium, it's this force pushing things along. It's not a force at all. It's like natural selection is not a force. It's not like gravity. It's just a description that we impose on nature to talk about what we observe happening. In this case, the fossil record. I remember seeing an X-Files episode where some monster creature emerged out of some weird inbred family, and they said, "Oh, that was punctuated equilibrium." It's like, oh my God, how these things trickle down into pop culture again as like some kind of force pushing things along. There's no force.
I think Steve Gould actually has a lot to answer for. And I think Steve Gould confused about 3 different things. There's what you talked about just now, which is rapid gradualism, where you have allopatric speciation, and progressive evolution is happening continuously, but in a different place. That's one thing. But he confounded that with mass extinction, which is totally different, nothing to do with it. It's a totally different thing. And also macromutation, Goldschmidt-type hopeful monsters, which again is a totally different thing. And he confounded those 3 different things because they all, in a verbal sense, are punctuations, but nothing to do with each other in terms of what's actually going on the ground in evolution.
Yeah, sometimes it feels to me as an outsider that because natural selection explains so many things, if you're a new scientist, you want to make a contribution, you feel like, well, I want to add something on top of that. So Gould famously said, well, we're going to introduce multi-level selection. Now I can talk about all these other things that happen above the level of natural selection operating on genes. And again, but that's problematic because exactly how does that happen? What's the mechanism underlying the higher level selection? In the book, let's switch topics. I want to talk about Christopher Hitchens. Your conversation with Hitch was just so moving. He's got that, it's his last conversation. He's got that raspy voice from his esophageal cancer. And yet he still, sort of hacks out these paragraph long, perfectly articulate sentences that are so beautiful. Just stunning. But I liked your conversation about religion, other things as religion. So, Nazism is a kind of a faux religion, communism, Marxism is kind of a faux religion. And now I see people making these analogies, that wokeism is a kind of religion. You have original sin. We're all born as racist. John McWhorter makes this analogy. Or Trumpism, it's like a cult, or it's like a religion with a, figurehead, cult of personality at the top and so on. Do you ever worry that analogy gets overused?
Yes, and I think it's important when you use analogies like that to recognize that they're only an analogy for part of it. And so part of what we think of as a religion is supernatural. And that doesn't apply to some of these other things. But part of it is tribal loyalty, fanatical devotion to it, punishment of heresies. You just mentioned original sin, which I like very much. By the way, when I first published The Selfish Gene, 2 clergymen came up to me and said that my idea of the selfish gene reminded them of original sin. I thought that was quite funny.
Whoa.
But and it's true that you can make different. I mean, in many respects, Stalinism and Nazism were religions. Hitler had grace said before meals. Instead, it wasn't for what we are about to receive, we thank the Lord. May the Lord make us truly. It was we thank Adolf Hitler for the good things that are placed on our table. It was more or less exactly what they had. Stalin had a similar kind of grace, a similar kind of prayer that wasn't supernatural. The cult of the Kim family in North Korea pretty much is supernatural. I mean, when bears of the Kim family were born, everything, the rainbows appeared in the sky, and birds sang, and all sorts of miraculous things happened. So that verges on being a supernatural religion. And I think it's important to realize that you can use an analogy in a partial sense. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to cover absolutely all the bases. It doesn't have to be supernatural in order to qualify as a religion in many respects, but not in all respects.
Yes, and of course we mean this in a critical way, because, say, critical race theorists who claim that we're all inherently racist, even if you and I are not personally racist, that it's baked into the system. It's kind of an original sin going back to America's founding years, 1619, slavery, and so on. Yeah, and the only way you could atone for it is, reparations, or, get down on your knees and apologize for, but I didn't do anything. No, I'm not talking about you personally. All of us collectively, again, it is like an original sin that you have to atone for and accept this doctrine as your savior, that kind of thing. I loved your discussions with Dan Barker's work, and the argument that the resurrection must have happened because the disciples went to their deaths, so believing it has to be true. And then Barker's one-liner rebuttal: 9/11. People die for causes all the time. It's pretty normal.
That's a very good rebuttal. I'm not sure it was Dan Barker, though, was it? Might have been Herb Silverman, maybe?
Oh, maybe that was it. Yeah. I kind of plowed through those chapters quickly. But in any case, yeah. But I think the larger problem is explaining religion, trying to explain religion. Is it adaptive? Is it co-opted of something else? It's so big a concept. It entails so many different things that it can't have one cause. It's got to have multiple causes. Sort of like in your conversation with Pinker, how do you explain art or literature, language? There's many, there's not going to be a gene for language. It's going to be thousands of genes because so many different components of language go into making it up. Same thing with religion. So why do people go to church? Well, their friends are going, the spouse goes, their coworkers are going, the music is nice, free parking, and so on and so on. And there's kind of a whole collection of stuff that they get out of it. And then maybe a little moral homily at the end of the sermon. And we're all going to donate and help this charity. And, that just goes on and on about the benefits, such that I think, when atheists like you and I think, well, if we could just explain why the cosmological argument or the fine-tuned argument is not sound, they won't be religious. I don't think that has anything to do with it, because that's not why they go to church in the first place.
It has a bit to do with it, I think, but it's far from everything, as you say. And I think that for some people, it actually is the reason they believe, but for many people, it isn't. They just, as you say, they go for all sorts of reasons.
Yes, and again, it's back to that religious truth. It's just what I believe, full stop. I'm not claiming I could prove it. I think that's what most people think. I think they haven't really thought it through, like, this has to be empirically true for me to accept it. Now, some Christians, theists and theologians think that, so they come up with these elaborate arguments that you've engaged with in your books, particularly the God Delusion. Here's their argument, here's why it's not sound, and so on. I think most people, the average believer, they don't really think it through that carefully. It's just, this is what I believe. In the same way you might think of an analogy of a political truth. Like, I'm a liberal, I think taxes should be reasonably high so we can take care of the poor and catch people that fall through the safety net, mentally ill and drug addicted and so on. That's our obligation. We should have an open immigration policy to take in asylum seekers. And so that's what I believe is a liberal. If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't be a liberal. I'd be a conservative. And conservatives would counter with, well, this is our truth. And I'm not sure to what extent either of those sides are true. What's the right tax rate? What's the right immigration policy? I don't know. Is there some experiment we're going to run to determine that? No. If this is your goal as a society, then that model works better than that model. But where did that goal come from in the first place? We want a society in which everybody's taken care of or something like that.
I'm quite interested in the way all those things you just mentioned, defining a liberal, the way they all go together. It's not obvious to me why they should, but it's true that if you know where somebody stands on one of those issues, you pretty much know where they'll stand on the rest of them. And it's quite surprising that political opinion is so one-dimensional. Christopher Hitchens was actually an exception because he wasn't classifiable on a one-dimensional scale like most of us are. But I think it's weird the way we are.
Yes. He, Hitch would change his mind if you had a better argument, or at least as he perceived it to be. I would recommend on this one George Lakoff's book, Moral Politics, that again, back to the use of metaphors and analogies. His metaphor is that the nation is like a family, and that for liberals, the family is like a nurturing mother family. And for conservatives, it's like a strict father family. And so for conservatives, the reason all these things hang together is that, we are by nature sinful, we're greedy, we're selfish, and so on. And you need a moral compass, a kind of a foundation to a moral society to be, kind of dropped down on the family by the father. He enforces the rules, and that's what the government is supposed to be like. The president is like a strict father family enforcer, whereas liberals think of it more of a nurturing mother. So you take something like the abortion issue, that young women get into trouble, they get pregnant or whatever, and our job is to, take care of them, give them reproductive choices, abortion, and so on. To the conservative, no. They sinned. They made a mistake, and that they should be punished for this and never allowed. You have to have the child, and so on. And and no birth control. Just say no, and so on. Or guns. If you think of conservatives, tend to say, well, we're in favor of small government. No, you're not. They love big military, big court system, lots of prisons, huge police force. And lots of and conservatives, I believe in individual autonomy and freedom. Oh yeah? How about women making reproductive choices? Well, not that. How about gays being able to do whatever they want? No, not gays. Right. So, it's a Lakoff's explanation is like, they're not in favor of small government. They don't want autonomy and freedom. They want this strict father-family structure as government and as a nation.
Yes, makes a lot of sense. What's the book called?
Moral Politics. I think that's the title, Moral Politics. Yeah, George Lakoff. He's a cognitive psychologist writing about politics, and because in his model, everything is metaphor. All of life that we make metaphors and analogies to understand things. And what's an economy? What's a political system? It's so huge that I can't get my mind around it. So I have to have these kind of models or metaphors. Sort of like Jonathan Haidt's, 5 components of being liberal or conservative, and which of the 5 you pick and select. These are just kind of heuristics to get our mind around a super complex system. So I also wanted to ask you about, how science works. You and I think Neil were talking about this. You mentioned falsification, Popperian falsification. That theories develop along, and as long as they're not falsified, we gain a little more confidence in them. But I think more and more that it's not really Popperian falsification. It's more like a Bayesian reasoning, that we pile up confidence with more and more positive outcome experiments. So in your own field of evolutionary biology, you stated in the book where you're very confident it won't be overturned, because after a century and a half, we got like 10,000 experiments. And it's not that it hasn't been falsified. It's more than that. It's that there's this huge amount of positive evidence in favor of it.
I totally agree with that. I think Popperian falsification. I suspect that philosophers of science are misled by the single example of Newton and Einstein. They always come back to that example, and it really works for that.
Right.
But for my field, it's just a fact. It's not going to change. We're not waiting for it to be falsified. It's not that it's so far survived attempts to falsify and it hasn't been. It is simply a fact that you and I are cousins of kangaroos and horses and pigs and chimps, and that's never going to change. It cannot change. Maybe natural selection is just about imagine somebody coming along with another theory, but the fact that we are cousins of other animals sharing a common ancestor, that is a fact for all time. Nothing Popperian about that.
Yeah, and this is why I'm reasonably confident that global warming is real and human caused, because we have decades now of evidence piling up to show that from independent lines of inquiry. It's not like these people know each other. The scientist that works on clouds and the other one that works on glaciers, they don't publish in the same journal. They don't even know each other. They don't go to the conferences to get their story straight against those conservatives that they want to overthrow capitalism. This has nothing to do with it, right? I don't know if you know these conspiracy theories about climate change is a hoax and all that stuff, but my confidence is high because of the independence of the inquiry that converge, this consilience of inductions, William Ewell called it, this convergence of evidence of independent lines of inquiry. And I think evolution's the same thing. It's not like paleontologists and geneticists are know each other or publish in the same journals. They don't. Then I wanted to just kind of talk about how far you're willing to go with science. Scientism is supposedly an insult or a criticism of people like me. And I think maybe yourself, Sam Harris, Steve Pinker, let's apply the methods of science to understanding art, music, morality. Can you determine right and wrong? And, as you know, because you've been critical of the kind of progressive left postmodernism, that there are no facts in cultural truths or moral truths. They're just these relative standards. And the moment you say, well, how about female genital mutilation? Is that just a relative thing? Some people like it, some don't. And then, usually you can push it that. So I'm just curious how you think about that charge of scientism and how far you're willing to go.
I'm interested in that. I too have met scientism as a dirty word, and sometimes they use it just as a dirty word for explaining anything. But you're talking about using science to explain things like morality. And I've been rather persuaded, I must say, by recent arguments that I've read, suggesting that maybe you do need a premise like suffering is bad. But who's going to deny that suffering is bad? I mean, who's going to? It seems it's such an easy premise to accept, and once you accept that, then science takes over. Science takes over because we can then work out what is going to cause suffering. It's harder for non-human species. There's room for argument about whether earthworms suffer, and I don't think we can necessarily settle that easily. I do have an argument about animal suffering, which is an evolutionary one based upon the idea of what it's about, what pain is for. Pain is a warning not to do that again. Pain is a negative reinforcer. So the animal is pre-programmed with a rule that says, if what you've just done causes pain, don't do it again. And that being the case, it's by no means clear that an intelligent species like ours is more capable of suffering than an unintelligent species. Actually, quite the reverse, because if an unintelligent species would require more pain in order to ram home the point that you mustn't do that again. You see what I mean? An intelligent species might be satisfied with just a red flag being raised in the brain saying, don't do that again, don't do that again. Whereas an unintelligent species that doesn't have much in the way of brain power might need a really big shot of pain in order to ram home the point that you shouldn't do that again. So there might almost be a negative correlation between the braininess of a species and the capacity to feel pain, suffer. So this is a kind of argument in favor of animal welfare. It's more than just giving them the benefit of the doubt. It's an actual positive reason for thinking that animals might be more capable of feeling pain than we are. I don't know if that's true, but at least it's an argument you can put. It's a plausibility argument, I think.
We're animals, so we can certainly suffer pain, as we know, but we have a meta level of this. We can think about the pain we're going to feel, but it's more like your red flag example, because people do not respond, say, to the death penalty. Like, well, okay, we're going to impose the death penalty if you murder somebody, but people that, lose their temper and they shoot somebody, they're not thinking in some rational calculation in a utilitarian manner, well, I better not do this because, 10 years from now, I'm going to be put to death, right? It's too delayed. Yes. So, but my larger point here, kind of following Peter Singer and Steven Pinker, and Sam Harris, myself, that part of our moral progress has become this kind of meta level, like, well, I know what it feels like to suffer that kind of pain. So, and I wouldn't want somebody doing that to me, so I shouldn't do that to them. This kind of principle of interchangeable perspectives. How would I feel if this happened to me? And, Singer's idea of the expanding circle, we've just been slowly, gradually, you call it consciousness raising, just kind of aware that other people are like this and that somehow we probably shouldn't do that, cause other people to suffer. So, and you have to start a moral argument somewhere. So you start with the suffering, like Jeremy Bentham, is not can they think or can they talk, it's can they suffer. It seems like a good starting point.
I like Peter Singer's book, The Expanding Circle, for the reason you've said.
Yeah. So, okay. So from there, then you start down the road of like, well, can science determine human values? What's right and wrong? So you can start with something simple like, is it okay for men to commit female genital mutilation against young girls? No. Why? Well, then you have a set of arguments. And then most people, I think, would agree with that. Even cultural relativists would have a hard time saying, no, that's none of our business. People should do whatever they want. But then when you move away from that kind of left wall of simple examples like that, then it gets harder. Like to what extent, like with Afghanistan, to what extent should we send troops in to protect the rights of girls in these Islamic countries where they have Sharia law? Well, yeah, we do have that obligation. Well, there's 20 countries. How come you just did the one? Well, because whatever.
Well, also they did it, and it didn't work out well.
In the Middle East or some such thing.
Yeah.
No. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on, so current events like that, to what extent, how can you say that abortion is immoral or it's moral or it's okay? I mean, those are harder issues. You have the rights of the fetus to live, the rights of the mother to choose. You end up with these conflicting rights. And here, I'm not sure science can determine what the right answer is.
Well, I think in the case of abortion, you can say that the capacity of a fetus to suffer is proportionate to its nervous system, which is negligible or totally absent. Or even if it wasn't, it's still a lot less than that of a full-grown cow or pig. And so if you want to be consistent, if you're going to be against abortion, you should also be a vegetarian. And Many of them are not. So at least we can make a consistency argument.
Right. So, but then you have to draw the line somewhere. So, in the court systems here, it's usually before the end of the second trimester, because after that, the neural networks are pretty much in place by the third trimester. Probably the fetus can suffer to a certain extent. And then you have this kind of legal notion of a personhood. Like, for example, in the case of Lacey Peterson, who was pregnant, her husband was convicted for double homicide because he killed her when she was in her third trimester of pregnancy. So that counted as a person in the third trimester. So here you get this sort of difference between the way scientists think, as you just described, in this sort of continuum way. But here's your principle of the tyranny of the discontinuous mind, which is a problem in a lot of areas. But the law, they have to draw the line somewhere. They got to go, before this day you can drive, and after this day you or take drugs or go to war or vote or whatever. You and Matt Ridley were talking about Wallace. So I want to just kind of clarify. I wrote a biography of Alfred Russel Wallace, In Darwin's Shadow, which is appropriate. Wallace, it gets back to this problem we were talking about earlier of adaptationism. Wallace was a hyper adaptationist. He thought everything should be explained as a adaptation by natural selection, and he could not figure out what the purpose would be of having a brain this huge, in which you're capable of doing mathematics and aesthetic appreciation and music and art and literature and so on. What's the purpose of that? And he famously said, you could have a brain the size of a gorilla is perfectly fine for survival, even for social relations and so on. You don't need all this. So that's when he imposed his higher intelligence. He wasn't religious in any traditional sense. He wasn't thinking of an intelligent designer plopping into the system, that maybe there was some kind of force of evolution driving it in some way, or something that we just can't quite understand. So it wasn't that he'd kind of lost his mind or he got old. He did all this in his 40s. He was in his mid to late 40s when he admitted to Darwin that I have this other idea and you're not going to like it. And Darwin wrote him back and said, I hope you have not murdered your child and mine, natural selection. It's a great one. And then in his 50s, he got involved in seances, back to Jamie and Swiss and magic. If you don't understand how it's done, it's just baffling. You think, well, okay, here's an example of the spirit world coming in. And he has a drawing in here in his little one of his books he wrote. See if I can find a picture of this drawing where he's at this seance, and I don't have it here anyway. They're all sitting around holding hands, and he marks where the psychic was, and then he was sitting here, and then the cabinet, and they turned all the lights off, and then whoa, all this crazy stuff happened, and we were holding hands, so she couldn't have done it, of course. And then he had this other story, this crazy story about his sister. He wrote this pamphlet on the scientific aspects of the supernatural. Let's see if I can find this thing here. And so in his archives, I'm showing you here a picture of the frontispiece, which was blank in this pamphlet he wrote on the supernatural. And then his sister hand wrote in what happened to her with this particular booklet. And I'll just read to you this while you give your voice a break there. So she writes, this book was written by my brother, Alfred, and with 24 others, copies of the book, was laying on my table. They had been there 4 days, and I had not had time to give them away. One morning, I had been sitting at my table writing and left the room for a few minutes, and when I returned, the paper parcel was opened, and the books laying on chairs and tables in every direction. I immediately called my friend, the medium, as you do, and told her of it, and then she said to write out what is the meaning of this, though I can guess. They are to be distributed and not lay here idle. Yes, yes, by Knox, then was rapped out this sentence. Okay, so this is this kind of rapping sound in which it's almost like a Morse code. Yes, right. And so she interprets this to mean, one for my sister Frances, I have marked it. Upon this, I opened one of the books and looked through the leaves and soon found marks with a red crayon, which I had on my table. I then said, if you could do this while the book was shut, you could write my name in this book and while it lays under my hand. In a few minutes, I opened the book and found Francis Wallace written. I said, now, dear spirit, write my marriage name. I shut the book and in 2 minutes opened it again, and the second time was written Frances Sims, her married name. That's December 1866. Oh, and here's the seance where Wallace says, I was sitting right here, and so on. So to Wallace, this is like, oh my God, this is evidence. This is empirical evidence. Look. Here's the booklet. It's all marked up. And then he fell for the slate writing. Where the medium would close this. This is a hinged slate here, and they put a piece of chalk in there and they close it, and then the chalk does its miracle. This is all just standard magic stuff, right? But again, he didn't know. This is a scam. This is a game. It's a magic trick, right? And so he has, and like in his archives, he has hundreds of examples of like that, like those, and says this is, to him, it's empirical evidence of this other life.
And that's why I think conjuring tricks are quite interesting philosophically, because they are so powerful. I mean, much more powerful than anything that fooled poor Wallace. But it is disquieting how powerful they are, and yet they do have an explanation, of course.
Yes, even among scientists.
Wallace described himself as more Darwinian than Darwin. And in many ways he was. I mean, he hated sexual selection. In at least the Darwinian sense of sexual selection. He wanted it to be more utilitarian than Darwin did. Darwin was happy to allow that female whim should be allowed to have a selective effect, whereas to Wallace, female whim was mystical. He didn't like mysticism in that sense. He used a bit of a contradiction there.
Well, anyone that lives that long and writes about that, so many different things is going to be. But like you and Matt were talking about Darwin, of course, it's a product of his own time, but he would be pretty liberal by today's standards compared to his contemporaries. And Wallace, even more so. I mean, Wallace was, he had definitely a feminist supporting women's rights, land nationalization. He was very strong critic of capitalism, particularly as it was practiced in England in the 19th century. And he was also weirdly an anti-vaxxer. He had quite a campaign against vaccinations, along the lines of injecting yourself with a piece of the virus, as they understood it then. Just seemed, counterintuitive, unnatural to him. So, anyway, that's it. Well, Richard, I know I don't want to keep you too long. I just want to get some final thoughts on, at this point in your career, to what extent can we solve the big problems like consciousness, free will and determinism, that kind of thing? Or are these conceptual problems and we're just never going to crack them because we just don't think about them the right way?
I don't understand what a solution to the problem of consciousness would even look like. So I don't know whether the solution will come from computer science or from biology, from philosophy. Free will. I always hate the free will question. I always get it when I give a talk.
I know.
Do you believe? I like Hitchens' answer. Do you believe in free will? I have no choice, he said. I think that's the way I answer it. Yeah. I read the stuff on it, and I guess we have no choice but to be to feel that we are determined. But we have the powerful illusion of having free will. So I don't feel comfortable thinking about it, but I try to avoid the question as I say. Consciousness, maybe it'll just go away. Maybe it'll kind of dissolve. Or maybe it'll have the problem that Darwin solved and Wallace solved, the problem of the complexity, the illusion of design. That's one big idea that solves a very big problem, a very big question. And I can't imagine if there is a similar big idea that will solve the consciousness problem. I can't imagine what it would look like. It may be that we'll just kind of chip away at it in a rather desultory kind of fashion. It'll kind of dissolve away rather than being solved in one fell swoop as Darwin solved the consciousness, solved the design problem.
Yeah, it's hard to say because, if we came back 100 years from now after being cryonically frozen, maybe the problem would be solved. It'd be like, oh, that's so obvious. Like Huxley. Why didn't I think of that?
Yes,
Right?
maybe.
It could be, or maybe it'll just... Okay, last subject on religion. You published The God Delusion in 2006, and since then the rise of the nuns, people with no religious affiliation, has gone up quite dramatically. Maybe to a certain extent, the influence of your work, but that of maybe the secular movement in general has had some influence. But in any case, if the trend lines continue, do you think it possible that religion will simply fall into disuse or be replaced by secular institutions? Do we even need to replace it? I mean, is it, Paul Kurtz had this idea, well, we need to build the equivalent of a secular church in every city where you can get buried and married and, so forth. But I'm not sure about that.
I'm not either. It's a separate question. And I know many people who feel very strongly we do need something like that. And they do want to set up kind of secular churches. And if they want to do that, that's fine. I don't feel the need for it myself. Will religion just go away? It might go away in Christendom, although in America I'm not so sure. But there's a huge problem of Islam. I mean, it's a major force in the world of benighted ignorance, and there are beginnings of signs. I hear sort of rumblings from Iran and from Egypt and Iraq that things may be beginning to shift, but we've got a long way to go there. The translation project that my foundation is running, translating books, for example, mine and others, into the languages of Islam, into Arabic and Farsi and Urdu and Indonesian. And there's big take-up for them. The God Delusion has been translated millions of times. Sorry, has been downloaded millions of times as a PDF translation into Arabic. And that's a very encouraging sign. So there's a sort of beginning to be a shift there, I think. In Christendom, it looks to me as though things are going in the right direction, quite a significant way, as you say. The rise of the nuns.
Certainly in Northern Europe, but now in America, evangelicals, and not to mention Catholics, are wringing their hands about losing members. To which I say, well, good, but in their worldview, well, that means the kind of decline of moral standards and values. But really, I think we've developed a pretty good system of secular values with a foundation of why certain things are right and wrong. Again, based on human suffering and other criteria. It's
a science, really. So, and as for the idea that we either get our morals from religion or should get them from religion, is such a horrific idea. Whatever else we get them from, we do not and should not get them from religion.
Well, right. This week or last week with the fall of Afghanistan, there's all this discussion about, well, hopefully the Taliban will adopt a new reading or understanding of, women's rights and Sharia law and so on. It's like, this is not the direction we can go because, just hope they read it the right way. What right way?
Quite, yes, quite.
I mean, unless Islam has an enlightenment like Christianity did, where they went through the Enlightenment and they became much more liberal, slowly, the abolition of slavery and civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, and so on, Christendom has gotten behind those movements, albeit late in the game and slowly, but they got there, because they're modern people that live in an Enlightenment influenced culture. But the problem is Islam never went through something like an enlightenment.
Also, they're told that the Quran is the inerrant word of God. So the only way it can happen is if they stop believing in it, which I hope they will, but it's harder.
Right. Well, Christians say that too, sort of. But they reinterpret the passages.
Oh, it's all metaphorical, it's all symbolic.
John 3, yeah, right. Yeah, you talk about that in your book. Right. This is what this really means. When Jesus said this, he really meant it's okay for gays to marry. Oh, really? Is that what he meant? Because 10 years ago, that's not what you said he meant. Yes, so theists will make the argument, for example, that, well, it was the Quakers and Samuel Wilberforce that were opposing the slave trade. So that's, 1 point for Christianity. Yes, but almost everybody in opposition to the Quakers were Christians. They were what we would call evangelicals, Protestants, and Catholics. They were totally in favor of the slave trade. So it really came late. And you can see it with the gay marriage debate because all religions were absolutely opposed all the way up until around 2011, 2012, when it began to shift. And then 2015, the Supreme Court made its decision to legalize gay marriage. And then most religions said, all right, I guess, we'll have to reinterpret those passages. So they get there. So that's encouraging. I don't think we have to, hope for the absolute dissolution of all religion, because it obviously serves people other personal purposes. But just as long as you have a secular government where they can't impose their values on other citizens of different faiths or no faiths, that's the key, I think. But Islamic states don't have those kind of constitutions like we have. So, just tell us what's next on your plate. What are you working on?
More
TV shows.
There's a book coming out in November called Flights of Fancy, which is about flight.
Okay.
Flight in animals and humans.
Oh, all right. Oh, nice. All right. Very good. So you haven't retired.
Oh God, no.